Welcome to Inspire Book Talk. I'm very pleased to say that my guest today is Matthew Welton. Matthew was born and bred in Nottingham, and after a short interlude has returned to live and work here. He works teaching creative writing at the University of Nottingham, and he's just published his fourth full-length collection of poetry, which is Squid Squad, a novel. It's a very beautiful cover, I think. Congratulations, Matthew.
Thank you very much. Cheers,
Claire. And welcome. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you. It's a joy to be with you.
I wondered if you could just start off by giving us a little flavour of what it felt like to be launching a book in lockdown, where normally you'd be having a lovely little, presumably peanuts and wine session and a short reading with your mates and some fans, and you had to do it all on Zoom. How did it go?
It was a real joy. It was exactly as you described. We've been planning a couple of launch parties through Carcanet. There was going to be one in Nottingham, and we were beginning to work with someone in London to set one up and talking to people in Manchester. And then the sort of inevitability of lockdown and being more careful around people crept in, and a few people who got books in the schedule with Carcanet got in touch with them and said, is there a way of doing this online? And they'd never done anything of that kind before. And I was the first, and I think they're up to 4 by now. But we just, I think between talking to Jasmine Linklater, who does marketing and publicity at Carcanet, and who's someone I know and have worked with in various ways for the last couple of years, we sort of said what we wanted and what we would miss. So, and to make it a little bit more multidimensional than just reading poems, they had the idea of having a host and asked me who I'd like to be hosted by. So we got in my friend, the poet Luke Kennard, and he's a very sympathetic reader of what I do. Anyway, every time he introduces me to someone he knows, he says, Matt's my favourite poet. So whether that's actually the case or not, I don't really mind. But it was just very good company. And at the point at which I finished reading poems and joined Luke, we then sort of opened a bottle of champagne, and I brought my family into shot at that point and made it as sociable as we could. And I think everyone at home hopefully had their own wine and peanuts, and and it was as close as we could get, I think, to not the real thing, but the usual thing.
Yeah, I think it's a very good prototype for an online launch. I've seen most of it videoed, and all the comments that were coming up the side and so on were very much like the kind of comments people would have made to you after a real life launch. So it was a very warm reception. Yeah,
it was really warm, and it was lovely to have a lot of people there, and a lot of people who I know from, who are friends or family or people I don't see very often, or poets, or I think there were a bunch of people obviously that I've never met in there too. But it was, the only thing missing was that mingling at the end, I think, and I think maybe it was nice to see in the comments people were chatting to each other and saying hello, but it would have been just nice to have stayed in a bar a little bit later and crawled home in a taxi later on. But never mind, it was part of the way that I think people have responded really well through the technology that's available to us to making not just the best of a bad situation, but doing something that perhaps works even better in some ways. It was accessible, it's savable, it's archivable, so that there are advantages to that, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think poetry lends itself perfectly to that, where other art forms perhaps don't so easily.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting thinking about poetry readings compared to fiction readings, because I've been to a lot of both over the last 25, 30 years, and feel that I enjoy both occasions, but I think as a kind of proportion, you tend to get similar numbers at the kind of things that I go to. And it kind of gives the lie to the, I suppose, because fiction writers generally, as a big generalization, would sell more books. Like fiction tends to be nearer the ground floor in the bookshop than the poetry section. But I think poets, because what they do, their set is perhaps more like if you go and see somebody singing songs, that you might have a collection out, but you can then choose the 5 or 6 poems that you want to read, the same way that, you know, if someone's got an album out, they wouldn't necessarily sing all the songs, and they wouldn't necessarily only sing new songs. And it's nice to, in poetry, because a poem might typically last a minute or two, it's very convenient and it works with the reading form. So I think it's lent itself very well to these electronic forms of performance that we're dealing with at the moment.
Yeah,
Feel
I
very,
agree.
you know, I feel very lucky. It's kind of weird that although it's a difficult time for everybody, I feel lucky to be sort of part of this moment, really, and to be part. It makes me feel that the community links are strong, which I
Yeah.
think is an important part of poetry, like with readers and with writers.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the speed with which people have embraced the technology, and we're all madly upskilling ourselves, both professionally and personally, has been a bit of a revelation actually to me too. Um, because the poetry is so good for listening to in short bursts, would you mind? I mean, you can perhaps talk to us a little bit about Squid Squad, a novel, and some of its influences and how you came about writing it as a sort of introduction to it, and then perhaps read a very short excerpt for us. Would that be okay?
So yeah, thank you. This new book, Squid Squad, a novel, is kind of, depends on your definition of novel, but it's perhaps not really a novel. It's a set of poems, and they're all about a bunch of characters with slightly fanciful rhyming or almost rhyming names, like Natalie Chatterley and Lola Wheeler and Dustin Mostin. And they kind of do events that they all do little gestures or actions that perhaps in a narrative sense suggests something more going on, but there's not an overall story. There's just, I suppose I was trying to create an atmosphere, more than anything. I was trying to create a mood, and I suppose I'm trying to, in the use of imagery, I mean, a lot of people really love imagery in poetry, and it's quite a book of extreme imagery, I would say. Like there's a bit of other stuff, but there's a lot of actions and things. There's lots of birds. There's lots of people eating things. There's lots of paper
Lemons.
scissors that are going rusty and stuff like that. But yeah, there's a kind of shabbiness as well. There's a deterioration, like things are crumbling and rusting, and it doesn't seem, I hope, to detract from the overall effect. So that's the most part of the book. There's a few shorter poems at the end of it, but mainly it's trying to create this bunch of people that I suppose was influenced by things like the Peanuts cartoon strip. That's the one that I keep going back to because I always loved it as a kid, and I think in my mind I'd always wanted to write something like it. And when I've been thinking about this new book, I've found there are some poems in my earlier books where in different ways I was trying to do the same thing. It's obviously been something that's been bugging me for my whole writing life, and I've only now got to a point where I felt that I, you know, comfortable in allowing myself to do it, and feeling that there was perhaps, I don't know, an appetite or that I got the skill to write the book I wanted to write, really. Shall I?
Yes, please. We'd love to hear a little bit. I think I should say here, everybody who talks about your work, and whenever there's a review, it always begins by saying, "I don't know what this is. I've never come across something like this," and I mean, that has to be an entirely good thing, whether or not they then go on to say anything else. Although, to be honest, your reviews do seem to be universally excellent. But people do start off by going, "I'm a bit baffled. I'm not familiar with this." So to some extent, a short reading doesn't give you that. So I hope people will go and buy the book and borrow the book and read it themselves, because it is a cumulative effect. But a little taster would be great.
Okay, well, why don't I start at the very beginning, which is so I'll do number 1 from Squid Squad. Dustin Mostin phones out for donuts, and the donuts don't arrive. Lola Wheeler unbandages her hands. The line of spilled paint leads to Bradley Ridley's apartment. Our shadows shift like schedules, mutters Neris Harris as she's cycling through the subway. Lola Wheeler feeds the chaffinches the chutney. Dustin Mostyn misplaces his magnetic spoon. A spherical lemon rolls into the kitchen. Audrey Chowdhury ditches the idea that between the provable and the probable, and the improvable and the improbable, the parallels might be anything but inexact. Ruth Reith snaps her catapult elastic. Audrey Chowdhury kicks off her sneakers. Our hunches hatch like hornets' eggs, whispers Hank Strunk into the dictaphone. The coffee cools slowly in the blue enamel pan. And I hope that gives that probably gives us as much of a taste. It's the rest of the book is just that, but more of it, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Luke Kennard mentioned that he sees it working as a film.
Yeah,
which
I think back to this thing that you said about people not knowing how to take it. I suppose a lot of what I do is trying to react to the reader in me, or the cinema goer, or the music listener, and I suppose wanting to. There are things that you get in. I suppose the obvious thing about film is that you can cut from one image to another, and that can be done whether it's between scenes or different shots within a scene. And I suppose that sort of, it's never clear, or it's never explicit at least, whether all these things in this book are taking place in the same place, or if the people live in the same place. But I would hope there's no reason to think they don't. And perhaps like that, it's like a film, and the images are meant to be vivid, and the idea of someone feeding chaffinches chutney, is kind of a weird thing, but it seems, I would hope, in the language and the poetry of it, it makes a sense of its own. But I suppose I'm trying to, I just respond as a reader, so I'm very much influenced all the time, and I'm trying to bring maybe different poems that I've read over the years, or with different novels and things that I'm still like that that teenager who watches Top of the Pops and then goes upstairs and stands in front of the bedroom mirror with his tennis racket. And I still read books, or books that I've read 30 years ago, that I'm going, I want to write my own version of that. And perhaps for that reason, Squid Squad is something that I have been trying to write through all the books I've written before. And it feels that now I've been able to bring some of those things together.
It was when I was reading the first Squid Squad part of it, I started, because it is very visual, because it is a series of vignettes, a series of little scenes without much drama or a great deal of action, unless it is the decomposition or someone muttering to themselves. There aren't a lot of voices either, except for the narrative voice, but you just say someone mutters or mumbles. So again, even the way they're described it's a little bit indistinct. But I sort of imagined walking past and just catching glimpses through windows, and it would be as though they are people who I know vaguely, but each of them is in their own separate little room doing their own separate little thing, which is yet somehow bound together by these common images that you use. And they've all got lemons somewhere, and birds are appearing, and so on. So I think if it were made into a film, you would have it. Feeding chaffinches chutney works verbally, in a way that it would be an interesting and surreal thing to see someone feeding chaffinches chutney. But if you don't hear it, it would make no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, and maybe if it is a film, it's more like a pop video than a proper narrative feature film. Because it is like these little images that create an atmosphere. But as you say, there's not a drama. I've spoken to some people who said they were trying to get it as a novel, and when they realised that wasn't the point, that they were able to get it as a poem. But yeah, if you're not racing to the end trying to work out who did it or what's going to happen to these people that you've been caring about so deeply for 64 pages, but I suppose that there's an atmosphere. I suppose what I'm trying to do is create a world that there is a an atmosphere. There's a sense of it taking place, and it feels like something that you can let yourself into as well as letting yourself out of. Is that a fair answer?
Yeah, that makes sense. I wondered, you talked about them being the characters that you start to love in the way that any writer who creates a character can become very attached to and interested in their creations. Do you visualize them? Do you know who these people are in your mind's eye? Do you know what they look like and how they move?
In a fairly low key way, yes, for some of them. Like, I think perhaps Angus Mingus and Natalie Chatterley are my two favourites, and I couldn't really tell you why, but I think I created all the lines and the images without necessarily attaching them to a character. So then, or maybe they got changed around a little bit in the drafting process. But I tended to give Angus Mingus and Natalie Chatterley my favourite images. So during the power cut, Natalie Chatterley doesn't budge from behind the drum kit. I was obviously a little bit pleased with that image, and I thought, well, she can sit there playing drums while no one else can see what's going on.
I think from the way you're talking about them, and also from the little bit we've heard, I think it would be a good point now to talk about the way that your work is often inspired by patterns, rhythms, the things words do, the way you can play with words, because that's really important. So not just the alliteration and the assonance we've heard of before, but also something mathematical or something overweening above everything, which the patterns of language can create, and which you seem to enjoy playing with and stretching. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair answer, and I think in this book I was trying to take the pressure off that a little bit, though I'm really not convinced that I've actually managed that. But yeah, I think in a lot of ways, when I first started taking writing poetry seriously when I was in my early 20s, I thought, I better go and learn all the technical stuff, and eventually did an MA in creative writing. But before that, I'd read a lot of how-to books and I'd never studied English, but went through a lot of poets and found new poets, and was thinking about, things like regular lines and meter and all that stuff, and rhyme. And in my earlier books, I'm certainly doing that kind of stuff a lot more than I do these days. But I was thinking about all those patterns in terms of being measurable, partly because I take pleasure in counting things and knowing, how, I don't know, like how many cans of baked beans there are left in the cupboard or something. Or I'm just thinking of the way that we're all shopping these days, trying to do it as little and as great a bulk as possible, if you can do that. But I like all that kind of counting stuff. But I think there was a point when I realised that I was taking more pleasure in the patterns that maybe don't form the structures of kind of that traditional aspect of poetry. So I liked rhyme, totally love rhyme, but I wasn't that excited about putting it at the end of the lines. So in this book, there's rhyme all over the place except at the ends of the lines. And I think that's the big turning point that's happened for me, that I realised that my interest in poetic technique wasn't actually about all those conventional structures. It was to do with having fun with rhythm and with sound, but the sounds weren't in a structured pattern, and the rhythms weren't in all those iambs and trochees and spondies and all those things, or weren't in pentametric lines or tetrametric lines or whatever, but were just where they happened to fall. And I think that's what I've finally let myself do in this book, and I suppose it feels like more fun. I mean, I've always tried to have fun, but I think I've allowed myself to do it a bit more readily this time, because before I was going, you're allowed to have fun, but it's also, it was like you're allowed to have fun, but you've got to be back by midnight. It's fun as long as this poem rhymes, or this poem does that other technical thing. And now I've gone, well, do you know what? I've been reading a lot of poetry for my whole life and writing poetry for my whole life. If I haven't absorbed what it takes to make a poem by now, I don't need to check up on myself. And I can try and trust myself a bit more.
Yeah.
I hope that comes across.
Yeah, I think so. You're not trying to create that perfect sestina.
No.
You seem to be at ease with the language in a different way, putting the language in a different way.
Yeah, I think there was a time when I wanted to do that and just couldn't do it really, and certainly learned things from trying to do it. But when I see poets who can do those things, I'm like, I feel envious, and I go and I still go and try and do that stuff, and I get halfway through and I go, this just isn't working. Do what you can do. So I guess I'm being a little bit kinder to myself, and I'm finding that there's stuff that I can enjoy doing, and hopefully people can enjoy reading, that doesn't have to be someone else's idea of what a poem is.
No, well, clearly, being unique is a great thing. Excuse me. I did want to talk about the project that you've done with Inspire before, which again touches on this love of pattern, which is the Myriorama project that you did as part of our poetry festival with a group of writers at Southall Southwell. Say it how you will. Just to very quickly explain to people watching, a Myriorama is originally a visual form whereby chunks of an image are created separately. The left and right parts of them, if you like, will join together so that you can put the parts in any particular order and they will always seem to create a narrative. There will always be a hill which is exactly in the background, or whether or not you put a church on it or a lake in it, and you can put people in it, and you can create a different narrative every time. And the Myriorama that you did was a sort of verbal version of that. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, it was one of my favourite things I've done, really, because I was speaking to your colleague Michelle when you were planning to do some projects around this, and Michelle was saying we're doing this visual mirror, and I was saying, well, have you come across the Raymond Queneau book, whatever it's called, 100,000 Sonnets? And we were talking about this idea that someone had done a very, very similar thing in poetry to what you've just described in visual art, and that and it was like a stable door, I suppose, that you would read down the page and there would be, say, 10 pages in the book, but you would turn because the page is cut across in between every line, you can turn just the top line. So effectively you've changed the whole poem just by changing one line, and then you can change as much as you want or as little as you want, and it creates a range of poems. And the famous one is this Raymond Queneau book, which was written in French, and it's been translated by various people, and you can find it online that it will automatically generate online 2 or 3 different versions. And we set about this project of doing it with actual people, and it was amazing that we did this workshop in, I will say, Southall, because I grew up in Carlton in Nottingham, and that's how we say Southall, but with respect to the Southwell people too. But we did it in the library one Saturday morning, almost 3 years ago now, isn't it? And I had this amazing group of people, some of whom had written a lot of poetry before and had attended a lot of events like that. A couple of people that were there for the first time, a couple of people who I knew, many people I didn't. And everyone was game for it. And I explained the mechanism, and we looked at different poems that had, to some extent, were playing with some of those ideas. And then we all wrote our own, I think it was 8 lines, the version that we came up with. And it was just beautiful because we put in the idea that for it to work, there had to be something that would bond it to other lines. So we were all had a sense of the kind of imagery we were going for, but also we didn't want it to make it too obvious. So, and it's a form that allows a little bit of elasticity, a little bit of playfulness. So we came up with it, and it was beautiful. And after we'd done it, I remember you saying to me, we're going to try and make an actual book out of this, which when we set up the workshop wasn't the plan. And it was such a joy when you actually made that, and I, I've got one in my hands, and what what an amazing thing to be part of. What an inspiring thing to be part of.
It was an incredible project, and it turned out better and different than we imagined it would, because it was such an unknown quantity. Quite the people who had been in the workshop, we always ask for feedback. And when reading through their feedback, it was the kind of stuff you would have thought would come back from someone who'd been on a boot camp, uh, but really enjoyed it, because it was as though you were this slave driver forcing these lines out of this machine that you'd created from these people, and they all felt very responsible for that. But they felt they were really worked hard. It was great, but they've been stretched themselves, and the comments were lovely, but it weren't like the normal comments we get after a poetry workshop.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I suppose unlike most poetry workshops I've been involved in, we kind of had an aim in a way that usually the aim would be, I want you to get something out of it. And it might be that you feel better about yourself, or that you've had a couple of hours away from the worries of your life, or that you've rediscovered the creativity that that you have, but because of life and family and all that stuff, you don't manage it. And I hope all that stuff might have been present, but also we were going, we also need 64 lines of poetry, out of which we're going to make so many 100,000 poems. So it was a little bit, as you say, a little bit boot campy, but we explained that at the beginning, and everyone kind of understood that they were going to be required to do a bit of marching, and but they didn't just march, they danced, they flourished. It was really exciting to see what came out. And some people, there was room for people to express individuality that gave the poem a bit of flavour, but it was a group composition, which is still quite an unusual thing to do.
Yeah. No, everyone, they all uniformly enjoyed it. They loved it. We will have some information about the Miriorama, and hopefully a little video of it, of the finished poem, or 100,000 poems, on our website. Going back to Squid Squad, and it's whether or not it's a novel. Did you call it Squid Squad a novel as a sort of gentle provocation?
Yeah, and when you say you're probably as much referring to my publisher as me. I gave it in when it was 32. There are 64 of those little poems like the one I just read out, and there were 32, and I submitted the book and said, I'd like to try and make this longer, what do you think? And Michael Schmidt, my editor at Carcanet, was like, yeah, we'll call it Squid Squad a novel. And I was like, yeah, that'll be fun, like that. And Michael, as well as being a very well thought of figure in publishing, has written a history of the novel. And I figure, if this guy has written the history of the novel, then if he says it's a novel, I'm quite happy to let him have dibs on that. But then in the sort of process, I kind of wavered a little bit, and in between talking to Michael, the editor, and Jazz, who was doing the publicity, and Andrew, who was doing the cover design, and I was like, yes, we're having that on. No, we're not having that on. Yes, we are. No, we're not. And everyone was like, Matt, just shut up, finish your writing it, and then come back and tell us what you think. And I'm glad that it ended up like this, because it's kind of there as a question. It's like, if someone goes it's not a novel, that's fine. They're very welcome to think that, but they might also think that about any novel that they read in the library anyway. But I suppose there are different traditions, and I'm interested in certain fiction writers like Lydia Davis or Donald Barthelme, whose fiction might not necessarily present a novel in the sort of archetypal way, but I think that that idea of a particular structure is a little bit of a red herring anyway, that there are certain things that work like that, but some novels are really, really about plot, some are really, really about character, and a lot are about atmosphere. And I suppose I tapped into the idea of atmosphere and was trying to create a sort of democracy of characters rather than having a protagonist or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, like, I make no bones about admitting that it's not a conventional novel by any means.
I think in some ways it's an invitation to start reading the book and then go, oh, hold on, it isn't a novel. Oh, hold on, what is it? And actually that gets your brain racing ahead on all the sort of things it may or may not be, which is part of the fun, I think.
Yeah, I hope so.
I think so. If when you're not writing poetry or indeed reading poetry, I know you do sometimes read fiction. I know poets are always very cagey about admitting this and quite fussy about what they do read. Can you tell us a bit about what sort of fiction you like to read for fun or for pleasure, if you do that?
Yeah, I think it's changed over the years, and I think this is probably quite a pivotal time. I always grew up reading either contemporary fiction or generally sort of 20th century stuff. As a teenager, I read lots of Graham Greene and George Orwell, and even like read, when I was like 18, read loads of Margaret Atwood because it was on my friend's mum's bookshelf, and I was like, that looks interesting. So I sort of read loads and loads of those. And then I suppose I've always kept an interest in that, and I work in universities and I'm involved in literature and creative writing departments. And before that, I worked in the big Waterstones in Manchester a long time ago. So was always aware and very interested in contemporary fiction, but also like had sort of read a little bit further back into the classics, but was very interested in experimental fiction too, like some of the people I've just mentioned. But then there was a point where I started reading crime fiction, partly as a relief from, reading a lot of poetry and a lot of literary criticism and stuff like that, and just realised that the pleasure of turning off and reading like James Lee Burke or Walter Mosley or someone, it's just, there's nothing like it. And those very much are real novels. That there's a lot of, there's real plots, and one thing very much depends on the outcome of another. But I'm very interested in that, in the idea that we sometimes think, well, not me, but a lot of people think of those genres of fiction of being of lesser value, because I don't see it at all. I feel that our reading and our writing doesn't just have one part in our lives, and it's really important to, it's important to wear comfortable clothes sometimes. It's important to wear smart clothes for others, and I think that the skill of writing good genre fiction is something that I would aspire to, and I'm never going to get anywhere near it. But just think there's such joy in reading that kind of stuff, which it's writing, but it's a long way from the world I'm involved in, and that's part of what I love about it so much, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that a lot of our readers who come to things like Readers' Day and to our events often have this conversation about literary fiction versus genre fiction, and the general feeling amongst readers is, why put them in boxes in that way? Because we read them for different reasons. They all require, a good novel of any kind requires an intelligence and an understanding, and I think it's, again, possibly publishers and the marketing machine that has to go on. It tends to put things in boxes in a way that readers don't.
Yeah, and I think there's a convenience to that too. That if you go to a supermarket and the oranges, instead of being next to the apples and the lemons, are in between the porridge and the cornflakes, then you'd take forever trying to find it. So if you go, well, I've read a couple of quite demanding highbrow novels, now I'd like to read something that's going to allow me to relax in a different way, then it helps to know where to find the crime novels or the sci-fi or whatever. But I think even like what the model you've just described, Claire, that there's certainly, all fiction is just a kind of fiction, but that I will also face this distinction between what's poetry and what's fiction, and also like there's a similar snobbery in poetry about what's performance poetry, and crikey, I mean, those kind of distinctions have been called a knife fight in a phone box, which I think is quite a nice image. That it's such a small world, that I would hope that people who care about poetry in their lives aren't going to resent other people for caring for whatever they care about, you know. And it even goes beyond, like, into non-fictional biography, you know, that it's all reading, it's all putting words together, and just like live and let live, get off everybody's case, you know.
Yeah, here, here. I think those things are slowly being dismantled. I mean, even since I started, I used to work in the poetry field. What does that mean? I used to I used to have a job in literature development before this one that was very much poetry based, and even in, I mean, that was 20 odd years ago, and even in that time, the way the publishers are responding, the way spoken word poets are becoming published, and published poets are acknowledging that most poems do need to be spoken, that's changed dramatically. So I think those things are moving organically
I think
anyway.
what happens, you know, particularly with things like the spoken word thing and the genre fiction thing, there's an aspect in that we're, as a society, recognizing that there is a diversity, and that might be in the diversity of writing, but it might be ethnic or class or other kind of measures of diversity, ways of looking at, ways of sort of dividing people up, or ways of allowing people to just find their humanity in each other. And I think, you know, a lot of, for example, black poets have been told that they're performance poets, and like you say, poems tend to lend themselves to being read out loud, and they also lend themselves to being read on the page. And they surely, like if I publish a book with a publisher like Carcanet, that doesn't mean I'm not allowed to go out and give a reading of it and perform it out loud, you know, when we're allowed to do such things again. But you know, like, why one and not the other? Why would you not be allowed to read a play and to hear it performed, or to see it on TV, or to see a film of it? Like, it's beautiful to me that there are different ways of taking the material and thinking about it, and those shouldn't be causes for segregation. They should be ways of unifying what we do.
Yeah, I think people who have wanted to build walls, but I think they are being torn down or never quite got off from the foundation stage. So I think that is changing. I think there is much more fluidity and much more acceptance of that within everything in society. So long may that continue. I think that's all we've got time for, you know. Well, I could talk for a long time, because I'm going to go back and read Squid Squad and have more thoughts about it. I want the people to talk to each other.
You want the? Do you know what? I've not talked to you about this, have I? Like, I was trying to write it in a way that the people would talk to each other, and the way that the characters would do things, and I couldn't make it work. I wasn't happy with those scenes that I wrote, so I kind of abandoned them in the end.
I just thought it was because I had a novel reading head on, and thought they must have dialogue, they must interact in some way. I mean, I did calm down about it, but I think because they're intriguing, they do intriguing, mysterious, enigmatic things, which they're not exciting and significant, and yet they are compelling and charming, sort of weirdly. So I wanted them to talk.
Yeah, I tried, and I wasn't able to. Maybe someone else can come and, you know, ghost a sequence for me or something.
Maybe that's the sequel.
Yeah, maybe someone else can do that, or we can collaborate on it. But yeah, I mean, I think I managed to create something that would, I hope, make people want to keep turning the pages anyway. But yeah, I tried to create more character interaction, and just, it didn't seem to work. Don't know why.
Well, but it does work. They do work as they are. In a way, leaving your reader wanting is a good thing, isn't it? So no. I'm going to wave it at the camera again so people see. Carcanet Press. It's in the bookshops. We will have copies in the libraries, which will be open again soon. You'll be glad to know. So strongly recommend, go out, and it is not like anything you've ever read before, and that is good. So Matt, thank you ever so much for talking to me today. It's been really interesting, and as ever, I could go on for hours more, but I will let you go. And
it's been a real pleasure.
Good luck with the continued promotion of the book and with your writing generally, and hope to see you in real life soon.
Yeah, that would be very nice. Thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much, Matt, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.